welcome everybody. We're so glad to be with you again today for a really, really important and timely program. Before we get into it though, let me take a moment and just say hi. I am the Executive Director of STAC, the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. We're here in North Florida, so in the panhandle of Florida, and our local program. We do serve 6 counties, so we're have a small region here. We do work on behalf of and with survivors of both sex and labor trafficking, adults and minors. Really, we have no categories of folks that we do not support who are trafficked or who are at risk. We provide care management to those who are trafficked and need our assistance. And every referral that we receive, we do provide assistance to that person if they can get it from our agency or from some of our many partners. Anybody doing this work knows, and any social services in general, that the only way you can get anything done is with a village. It always takes a village, and we're certainly no exception there. We do work also in our rural areas, and I keep this as a point on our slides because so many times people think that human trafficking is only a metropolitan or a big city phenomenon, and we know we see this in our rural areas. We certainly do where we are, and we know it's that human trafficking, both sex and labor trafficking, are everywhere. Also, we do tons of community education because you know that old saying, you know, that the eyes can't see what the brain doesn't know. So we get out there and talk about some of the myths and misinformation that's out there, correct the record so that all of us can be smarter and better, so we can recognize this and provide services and support to survivors. And we do that. We can do it across the board, and we can do it agency specific. So just be in touch with us if you'd like to know more. Next slide, please, Lisa. Some of the materials that we have are available for free on our website. In fact, all of our materials are free on our website. This is our website. I put it up earlier also. We always get questions during this. Will this be available to watch later? And the answer is absolutely yes. Just like all of our Third Friday programs, we put them up on the website. I will put that's our main homepage. This is where you can get this program, the PowerPoint, and other programs later. All of our services are free of charge. And as we go forward here, I do want to tell you that they're free to you, but they do cost something to produce. So we always like people to go on our website. And if you feel so moved, definitely, if you feel like you've gained something, some new information that's going to help you, please feel free to support us with your funds. It's how we keep going. You know, we wouldn't be able to do it without people like you who share their time and treasure with us. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things that we did starting, I think we started last year. Now I can't remember if it was the year before, but we do a podcast. Ours is different from what I could tell from anywhere in the country. We only talk to survivors. We only interview survivors of trafficking who are in a place in their life where they are advocating, where they are talking about what's going on. You know, we work really closely with survivors, survivor consultants for this one. And I also want to tell you, these are not exploitative conversations. I know you've seen some of those times when survivors are asked to just, quote, tell their stories, and that's it. That's wrong. We need to hear from people who are experts, who are lived experience experts about what we can do now, right? How we can be smarter in what we're doing and how we're approaching. So, and I also, I haven't done this before, but let me just ask you all, if you, if you know of a survivor who's doing advocacy work, and might be interested in talking to us on the podcast. We just dropped one from a wonderful survivor expert named Holly Nadell. She talks about the banking system and how traffickers use banking to hide their assets, to move their money, all of that. And she herself talks about how her life changed when she was trafficked. So next slide, please. And now the presenter. So I'm so happy. As I said, we're in North Florida, so Georgia is literally 30 minutes from my front door. So it's always a pleasure to be connecting with our neighbors to the north. And today is just another one of those days where I am so grateful to both Amy and Victor for joining us. So welcome to you both. And what I'd like to do is give you all a little bit of an intro for both Amy and Victor, and they can talk a little bit more about who they are and what they do as they go through their presentation. But let me start out by saying these two folks have worked together in Georgia. Victor's from Florida, Amy, Georgia. And now Victor's back in Florida. So we have this wonderful pair, this duo that can bring us this information, and in such a great way. I know you're going to really learn a lot. So let me start talking about Amy. Amy's full title is the Program Director for the Sexual Assault, Child Abuse, and Human Trafficking Unit in Georgia's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. She and her team have competitively secured over $19 million in federal and private foundation assistance for Georgia's criminal justice programs. And along with developing and overseeing the Georgia Coalition to Combat Trafficking and Agricultural Labor Trafficking Task Force, Amy is also responsible for the management of state and federal grants, providing direct services, and so much more. And so much more. So I'm going to just stop there for you, Amy, and just say welcome. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I thank you so much for your time and being with us today.
Thank you, Robin.
And Victor. So Victor is many, many things, and I'm only going to give you a kind of a thumbnail. Victor B. Williams is an internationally renowned and respected anti-human trafficking advocate. He's retired from law enforcement, has over 34 years of domestic and international experience. 91, he joined U.S. Customs Service and later became, which later turned into the Department of Homeland Security. In February 2011, he was assigned to a special agent in charge in Miami's human trafficking group, and in 2012, the coordinator for South Florida. He retired, but that's when I think I met you right after that, Victor. Because you've got so much work in Miami. The next thing I knew, you were in Georgia. So then he got recruited after he retired to be a security counsel for the Atlanta Hawks basketball club, and later coordinated the Georgia Coalition to Combat Trafficking. Victor now has an organization he founded called Quest to Freedom, and he's also the vice chair of the Miami-Dade County Human Trafficking Coalition. And I just want to say to Victor, I've seen you at meetings here in Florida since you've come back. I'm so grateful for everything you've done, both here and in Georgia. And I think it was one of those calls because we check in every once in a while. And I think we just got talking about gangs and forced criminality. And before I knew it, he's saying, hey, Robin, Amy is the person that's really got to talk to you about this. So that's, the rest is history, as they say. So thank you, Victor.
Well, thank you, Robin. Always a pleasure working with you guys. And every time I'm signing on to this, I'm even learning. And that's one place we all need to keep our minds open in this space. If you're working, to keep your mind open to continue to learn, because things are always changing.
You got that right. Absolutely. And one of the things I'd also like to say, Amy and Victor, did you want to add anything to my intros that I just did for you all?
Robin, I will add that it is a pleasure to be presenting with Vic Williams again. As you mentioned, he used to coordinate the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking, which was an ECM task force that we had in my unit. And I lost him to the great state of Florida. But Vic and I did a lot of training and presenting across Georgia. And so I'm thrilled to be able to work with him again today, because what Vic brings to the table is a tremendous amount of passion, in addition to his expertise to this topic. And so thank you for giving us the opportunity. I'm excited today.
You both are so welcome. So you want to, as you're pulling up your slides and sharing.
Sure. Vic, do you want to tell them how happy you are to be presenting with me as well?
No doubt. I don't You know how Amy does her job, as you can see her title. You know, just an amazing human being that has energy and passion for this work. Like I've learned from her so much, and it's always an honor to work with her and be part of her presence, because you guys will learn something.
And
Okay, you didn't have to go that far. You didn't have to actually lie, but thank you. Okay.
well, and one of the things I also, as before you get started, just to emphasize for everybody that the chat and the Q&A functions are there for you all to interact with. Amy and Vic have graciously agreed to take your questions during the program. We will save 10 minutes at the end for more questions. And I also want to say this to Amy, after working with you on the slides and everything. I love how you've integrated this topic in several different ways. And I think that what everybody is going to see is how the issue of human trafficking is not siloed in one area or another. It really goes across so many different areas. And I promise you, Amy, with your background and experience, I can tell that you are just the perfect person to be speaking with us today. So
thank you.
I am going to go off, and everybody, I'll be answering and responding to your chats and Q&A, and we'll see you back. If we get some questions, I'll let you know.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be here, as I said, presenting with Vic. We're going to talk today about human trafficking and the intersection of illegal street gang activity. This is kind of a shortened version of a presentation, so we're going to hit some highlights today. I think that this particular audience probably already has a pretty good understanding of human trafficking, so Vic and I will kind of just hit some highlights there, but obviously know that, you know, this topic, we can spend days talking about it. And so high level today, just to give you kind of a little bit of a taste of some of the things that, you know, we feel like are issues here in the state of Georgia. And also hopefully we'll leave you today with some ideas if this is an issue in your area, about how, you know, you may be able to address it. Would also love to hear from anyone about what they're doing in your state or jurisdiction, specifically to address this issue. Because as Vic said, we're here to learn as well. So thank y'all again. We're just going to go ahead and dive into it. Full disclosure, my agency was impacted by this Microsoft outage today. If for some reason my screen goes blank, which I don't anticipate, but Vic will take it from there. Just kidding, Vic. I will call in, and the PowerPoint is in good hands with Robin and all of our moderators today. So if there is a slight interruption, it is because of that, and we'll continue as quickly as possible. I think we've prepared. So getting right into it. The first thing we want to clarify or point out to you is that we know that human trafficking is a problem. I think you obviously know that, or you wouldn't be here as well. What you see on your screen right now is the famous Polaris heat map. This is based on calls that are coming into the national hotline. So you can see in our country, we know that human trafficking is an issue. You can see where we have hotspots on our coasts and our metropolitan areas, but you can also see even in our most remote and rural areas of the country, there's still calls coming in, and there are probably more. These are just the ones that are coming into that hotline. So they have to know about the hotline, and they have to be calling into it. We know that the issue, because of the nature of human trafficking, the covert nature of human trafficking, there is a lot more of it happening than we are even aware of. And I would say similarly, we know that we have a gang problem in this country as well. This particular data that you're looking at, I think, is a drop in the bucket to what we are really experiencing now in the year 2024. Tens of thousands of gangs exist in this country. I think this is as I mentioned, in need of a new survey and updating, because 33,000 gangs is a drop in the bucket, I think. But more importantly, if we don't even know exactly how many gangs we have in this country, we do know that gangs are responsible for approximately 50% if more of violent crime in our jurisdictions. And we know that gang membership has been on the rise for many years. And there's reasons for that. And we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the societal reasons why we have an increasing gang problem in this country. And we're going to suggest, hopefully, a few things that maybe we can all be doing about it. It's a big problem, and big problems sometimes take a lot of effort to address. And it's, as Robin mentioned before, it's multifaceted and complex. And so that is a little bit of a preview, I think, of some things that we're going to be getting into shortly. I mentioned we're going to talk a little bit about trafficking, just to hit the highlights and give a high level view of really kind of what some of the issues and complexities are with sex trafficking. So, Vic, why don't you talk a little bit about the crime of human trafficking itself?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And, just, you know, as we're going through this, just to give you guys a little background on how we got here, Georgia has a gang association, and they were having a meeting, and we had been trying to connect with them to provide them this training, because from our information that we were seeing that gangs were missing a lot of these investigations. And so we were invited to one of their meetings, and we kind of sat through the meeting, not just for our part, but, you know, I sat through the whole meeting and realized that if you really look at gangs, there's labor trafficking and human trafficking all over it. We mainly were addressing the sex trafficking issue, but labor trafficking is seriously a part. And there's only been one case in America out of Utah that has actually charged the gang with labor trafficking. So we may tap into that a little bit more. But when we look at the definition of human trafficking, I always like to point out the first three letters of force, fraud, or coercion, because you need one of those elements to have a human trafficking case. There are some other things like transporting, you know, different things like that, you know, that makes up the crime. But to have a human trafficking case, you must have force, fraud, or coercion. And remember that those three elements only apply to adults. If you're under the age of 18, you do not need force, fraud, or coercion when you're looking at sex trafficking cases. You need it in labor trafficking, but when you're looking at sex trafficking, you do not need to have any of those elements. Also, so when we look at, like, how does this really break down? You look at actions, you know, you're recruited, people are harboring, and these are some of the other crimes that goes into, you know, when you look at defining human trafficking. But again, it goes back that you need the means, force, fraud, or coercion. So when you see recruiting, harboring, transporting, obtaining, those are some of the actions that goes into having the initial actions that go into having a human trafficking case. Obviously, we talked about the means, force, fraud, or coercion. Force is obviously the physical part. Fraud has always been a weaker of the three elements. And we look at it like, hey, come to wherever you are, be a model. And when you get there, they were, well, we don't want you to be a model. We need you to do something else. Prosecutors always felt like you can walk away if that is the case. But when you look at force and coercion, coercion is the threat of hurting you. I always say, if you have a need, if that need is so strong that for yourself, be careful, because you can be exploited. It's not just, you know, it could be housing, the coercion. You're going to be kicked out of a house. You may not eat. You may not, you may need drugs. A lot of traffickers, some put their victims on drugs to be able to control them. So when we look at coercion, which is really the strongest of them all, because we always believe if I can get your mind, I have your body. Traffickers are not always physically abusing their victims, but mentally it's 100%. And a lot of times when I talk about this, I always talk about the culture. We need to understand the culture of all of this. This is what's driving us. It was culture that we created it, and it's culture that maintains it. And one quick example of culture that we do is we do a thing called victim blaming. Oh, why did you wear that dress? Why did you go out late? Why were you, drinking so much? We really have to get away from that cultural mentality, because it's not allowing our victims to even come forward to say that they're victims. So please, when we talk about these things, remember culture is the key, and we're going to be touching on that a lot. And then obviously the purpose. There's a third party. Somebody is, benefiting from the sell or the actions of the first two. And this is what makes up the definition of human trafficking. And if I miss anything, Amy, please jump in there. Obviously, again, when we talk about culture, a lot of these things come into play. We think, girls, this is only happening to women. That is not true. When I retired in 2018, there was an increase of 46% of boys and men being caught in human trafficking, which those numbers are still continuing to grow. Only poor people and immigrants are victims. Well, one of the things that we've been able to do in South Florida, especially in Fort Lauderdale, when they look at specifically with their children, they've been able to nail down like how many children are trafficked in their city, the demographics of the children. But one of the most things that stick out, and I think when we really look at this from a national standpoint, when we're able to really start to fine tune how we get our information and understand the numbers, one of the things that we've been able to find out in Fort Lauderdale is that I don't care if it's 50 kids or 100 kids that they find traffic in that area. We're learning that a high percentage, anywhere from 70 to 90% of their trafficking victims are community kids. And what is a community kid? A community kid is a kid that doesn't necessarily come from the poor side of town or at risk. They're not part of the juvenile justice system. These are our kids, good kids. They're not in trouble. They go to school. They do their homework. We're forgetting that these children are targeted. And it's so, and I love giving those numbers, because a lot of times when we work in this space, we think it's happening to everyone else. It can't happen to me. So we really need to be understanding that traffickers are targeting all kids, not just the ones that are in poor settings and vulnerable situations. They're targeting all kids. So we must be aware of that. We look at traffickers are strangers. That is not true. If you start looking at statistics, we will see that there's a high number of victims. They either know they're a trafficker, or there's familiar trafficking where family members are trafficking their kids or family members. So we need to be aware of all these things. And what we do understand, I know when we were preparing for this and some of the discussions that we have, and she mentioned it earlier, we always think that trafficking is happening in your big cities. That may be true in the sense of because of the numbers, they're high. But when we look at our rural areas, believe it, I mean, we're all dealing with the same mentality of culture. When I talk about culture, especially with men, when I used to travel around the country educating people on police departments on human trafficking, and that being a dominant male world, I often get the question, I often hear this statement, prostitution, the world's oldest profession. Well, first of all, farming is the world's oldest profession. But when I hear that, especially from men, my response is because we're the world's oldest customer. I mean, human trafficking does not exist if there's not a market for it. So, but we live in a culture that we demonize the person that's selling, who could be a victim, instead of demonizing who is the majority of men who are creating this market. On some of my PowerPoints, I use how we use the media. For instance, there are movies. One of the slides I use is a Tom Hanks movie called Bachelor Party, where there's a part in the movie where a pimp actually walks into the party and want to know where his girls are. So we've glorified this stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I think Amy has a surprise slide for you guys with me in this, but yes, I mean, we really need to have an open mind. People need to understand that, you know, if I have your mind, I have your body. And that's something that we have to understand, because a lot of times when we see people standing around free, and that's a reason why we stopped showing pictures of human trafficking victims bound, because that's an easy victim you can see. But the victims don't look like that. They look like us. They're not tied up to a bed. They're walking around. They're amongst our crowds, and we don't see them because our minds are not thinking in that fashion. So we really need to open up our minds and break a lot of our cultural mental thought habits in order to see victims when they're in our presence. When we attended the gang association meeting in Georgia, not only did we see trafficking in a gang as far as labor trafficking, and if we have any investigators out there, I want you to picture this, you know, because it can be a form of defense. It could be a tool that if you've been trying to, you know, investigate this gang and you just don't have any tools, well, you know, this is something that you can offer to someone that may be willing to speak. Is that, you know, a gang operates in that labor trafficking space, that if you don't rob this store, if you don't hurt this person, what is going to happen to you? So coercion is written on it all day when you look at it. So when we really look at gangs and trafficking, just don't visualize the sex part of it, because that's an obvious, but let's look at the labor trafficking issues in it. So after we did that training, the gang association was they were so taken aback by what they were missing, that the next steps for Georgia is that we created a training that will qualify gang associations. So part of this PowerPoint came about when we were setting up at their next meeting to do an initiation of giving this training and having them sign forms of this understanding that they understood human trafficking, which gave them another level of qualification. So that was really good. And if you guys are out there dealing with different gang organizations or task forces that are addressing it, this is a great way to connect with them by offering this training and somewhat giving them a training at a level that they can consider themselves certified in human trafficking.
And we're going to get to some great examples of how Georgia has done that. I love that so much, Vic. And also just the fact that you're getting out of the silo of this is gang, this is trafficking, this is crimes against persons, you know, just the sort of siloing that can happen in some agencies is great. So are you able to pick it up with who is the victim here, talking about this side?
Yeah, sure. So, and so a lot of times when people talk about, you know, hey, Vic, where do victims come from? Well, I say that victims and traffickers, they all start in someone's home around the world. And when we talk about that, when I get to talk to parents, I'm sure there are parents on here. I tell parents, you must create relationships with your children that they could come and talk to you about anything. And what does that mean? That means sometimes parents, we have to not react to some of the things that they tell us, right? Parent, you must deal with some of your trauma issues. This is very deep because, you know, victims, where we see in trafficking, unresolved trauma creates the vulnerability that traffickers seek to exploit. So those vulnerabilities are definitely coming from home, from whether it's parents' trauma that they're passing on to their children, or creating trauma, unresolved trauma that kids are not dealing with, that are creating this. And I won't get too far into this part, but you know, one of the things that we talk about is some of the solution. And I ask parents, like, what are we teaching our kids about love? So that's a whole nother PowerPoint that we can go through. But when you look at the different types of people who can be a victim of human trafficking, it literally can happen to everyone. People are missing in America every day. We don't always find them, but taking is not the 100% way that victims are gathered by traffickers. It is much easier than that. And usually it's a grooming process of getting to know, whether it's following kids on games, connecting with them, just getting them in their presence that they can start learning different things about them, finding out what those weaknesses are, and then exploiting those weaknesses.
When we do this presentation live, we often poll the audience too, right? Which this could have been a good poll question. Like, how many of the individuals that you see on your screen are actually human trafficking victims, right? Because I think Vic was just talking about common misperceptions. One misperception is who's a victim? Like, who is actually a victim? Who is not a victim? So if you want, you can kind of type in your chat how many you think, or Vic, you might have already given the answer. I'm not sure.
I did.
Okay. How many of the individuals are actually human trafficking victims? We have one. Number one is an adult who sells sex to pay for college tuition and rent. Number two is a runaway who sells sex for food and shelter. Number three is a sex worker who keeps some of her profits but is threatened or abused by a pimp. Number four was an individual who was promised a job as a waitress, but then taken to a bar and sold for sex. Number five is a worker in an illicit massage business. And they are sold and their passport is taken and they're physically forced to stay. And then finally, we have a minor who's kidnapped, taken across borders to a brothel and sold night and day. Love to hear your thoughts in the chat on how many of those you think are victims of human trafficking.
Looks like we're getting comments from 4 people, all of them. Some say 5, 5, all of them 4. Yeah, that's
the correct answer is 5. Number 1, did you get it right, Vic?
Yeah.
Hope so.
Of course I did.
Number 1 is not a human trafficking victim. That is a voluntary sex worker, and all of the rest of them are human trafficking victims. So I love this graphic because it really does kind of demonstrate all the different ways people can be trafficked, but also how that is sometimes a misperception as well in society. So I'm gonna ramp it up here a little bit because we're probably running behind on time.
And Amy,
yes.
real quick, and you guys go through that, all you got to do is go back and remember the 3 elements. So when you apply the elements to the 5 that are trafficked, then you would see the trafficking. So remember your elements. You got to have one of those 3 elements, unless they're under the age of 18. Go ahead, Amy. Right.
Excellent. And a good point, because if you look at number 1, sometimes people think number 1 is a victim of human trafficking. If that had said a minor, then it would have been all of the above. Good point, Vic. Thank you so much. Vic has already talked about some of these indicators of human trafficking. Controlling relationships, a daddy, boyfriend, aunt, or godmother, document confiscation, no access to earnings or no earnings at all, signs of physical or sexual abuse, monitored movement, an individual who doesn't make eye contact. Some of these can be indicators of human trafficking, can also be indicators of other things. Sudden changes in behavior. There's lots of reasons why someone might suddenly change their behavior, but human trafficking or being victimized or exploitation is one of them. Truancy, and of course, repeat runaways. And Vic, I think, has already touched on that a little bit. Where trafficking can occur, anywhere. Hotels, apartments, modeling agencies are common places where trafficking occurs. Commercially fronted brothels, travel agencies. I mentioned illicit massage businesses, nail salons, strip clubs, etc. Bottom line, it can happen anywhere. It can happen in a home, as Vic mentioned, with familial trafficking. It can happen in a rented home. It can happen in an Airbnb. It can happen anywhere, for sure. Traffickers can also be anyone. It can be any age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background. They can be business owners, family members, labor brokers, intimate partners. We've seen cases many times of husbands trafficking wives, We had an operation not too long ago that a husband dropped off his wife for trafficking, for exploitation. Can be a pimp, can be a diplomat, and it can be a gang. The reason why we're here today. What they have in common is the manipulators, the force, the threats, document confiscation, psychological coercion. We had a case here in Georgia where a trafficker threatened to burn his victim's grandmother's home down. That's coercion. Drug inducement as well. And they are compelling adults into forced labor, commercial sex, or children being sold into sexual exploitation as well. Here's some traffickers. Again, could be anyone, could be a female. I used to think the guy on the bottom row, second to the left, was a priest until I looked closer and I realized that's just an undershirt he's wearing. But it could be anyone. Boyfriend, older friend, peer, hotel clerk, spouse, mother, grandmother. They do it because it's easy money. There is a tremendous amount of money involved in the exploitation of individuals in human trafficking. It's covert, it goes undetected. There is an endless access to vulnerable individuals. So what it comes down to is supply and demand, simple economics. There is a high demand, unfortunately, for reasons Vic has talked about. And there is a high supply of vulnerable individuals as well. We always say, you can sell a drug one time, you can sell a gun one time, you can sell a little girl, and I still call a 17-year-old a little girl, although most of them wouldn't like that. You can sell a little girl multiple times a day. So it's very, very, very lucrative. And that is what gangs are for. That is their purpose, is to make money in an organized criminal way. Illegal street gangs. Yes, Vic.
And Amy, I want to throw in too.
Yes.
When we're talking about traffickers, yeah, we're talking about that person that's controlling, but there have been laws that have been updated federally. So make sure you know your state laws on this.
Yes.
They have laws like soliciting. So if I'm an adult male and I'm soliciting sex with an underage girl and I do one overt act to make that happen, that person can be charged as trafficking now in a federal. So
yes, and the state of Georgia as well, but you're absolutely right. You have to know your own state laws as well. Good point. Quickly, the way they recruit vulnerable individuals are a few different ways. Cold call, they may just hang out somewhere where they might see a vulnerable individual. A trafficker is well equipped to notice the signs of someone who may be susceptible to their manipulation. Someone who doesn't hang out with the rest of the crowd, someone who's got their head down. These are things that they know to look for to then try to recruit that young lady, typically, could also be a male, into working for them as a trafficking victim. If we had more time, we would go into a lot more on that part of it and that technique, but just know that's one technique. I think the most common, and Vic would probably agree, is the boyfriend technique, or the Romeo technique. You'll hear it sometime, the romance technique. It's when a trafficker makes a victim believe that they are their boyfriend, their daddy, etc. They may be, but the purpose of that manipulation romantically is to get them to then willingly go ahead and engage in the commercial sex act of which that trafficker receives the money. If that makes sense. He might say, no one loves you like I do. You're beautiful. I'll be the daddy you never had. Oftentimes these vulnerable victims have never had that experience before. Vic, I know you could go on and on about this. Do you have anything like briefly you want to add?
And it goes back to what I was talking earlier when we talk about culture, when we talk about where victims are created. These vulnerabilities are created in homes all around the world. And so that's why I stress so much, like, if kids are our future, let's start preparing them for that. And how do we prepare them is giving them the courage and strength and security within themselves. So every day when that kid walks out the door, you know, they don't need to belong to anyone because they have a certain love for themselves. We won't get all into that, but that we may talk about it a little bit. But that is my message of today is parents, what are you teaching your kids about love? Because there are traffickers telling their victims, I love you. There are victims telling their traffickers, I love them. But how do we define that for ourselves? And I will leave with this, a true measurement of love for self are the boundaries that you set for yourself that educate people who you are and how they should treat you. So if your kid is walking out the door a little docile with their head down and because they're not feeling love for themselves, or, you know, something bad happened at home that they're just not dealing with, then, you know, you're adding that vulnerability more to kids when we don't take care of those things.
100%, 100%, Vic. Thank you. Absolutely. We're going to get back to that in a second. Guerrilla technique, to close out our section on techniques, although I think we're going to talk about online recruitment as well. Guerrilla technique is a little bit interesting because it's not common as an initial recruitment technique. All right. So when we talk about the movie Taken, where someone is kidnapped, it doesn't happen frequently. Not going to say it never happens, but it is way less common than what we would see in reality, which is a cold call technique, a boyfriend technique, etc. However, where the guerrilla technique comes to be more prevalent is after that initial recruitment stage. Okay. So very similar to those of you who might be in the domestic violence field, where we see the cycle of violence in a domestic violence situation. There's a similar cycle with traffickers as well. I'm going to recruit you. I'm going to romance you. I'm going to buy you things. I'm going to make you feel like I love you and make you feel like you've never felt before. Then I'm going to start to abuse you, and I'm going to start to exploit you. And if you don't do what I want, then I may physically assault you. I may sexually assault you. So that is so you can go from a boyfriend technique to a guerrilla technique. You hear the term guerrilla pimp. That is someone who uses physical violence to control his victims. So good distinction to make between those two. Vic mentioned parents. Vic and I have people ask us all the time, parents, how do I prevent my child from being trafficked? Vic's already talked about some of it. You love them. You make sure they have self-esteem. You make sure they have a safe home, that they have open communication. But you also know where they are, and you know what they're doing online. If you have a good relationship, an open, loving relationship with good communication with your kids, you know where they are and you know what they're doing online, your kid is 100 times more safe than a child who does not have a parent who does that. Vic, do you want to, what you see on your screen now are some of the online recruiting. They change all the time. I can't keep up with the dark web and all of the apps that are online. But there are multiple ways that traffickers can use the internet to recruit victims. Is there anything you want to add, Vic?
And I just want to add, when we talk about the word love, let's define what that means to our kids, because a lot of young people, and we've gotten that love is more about what we feel. Love is truly about how people treat you. And it goes back to what I'm saying, love for self. You know, you're educating people, your boundaries and how they should treat you. So we can't give what we don't have. So if you decide to have this discussion of love, let's define what it really is. And it's mostly about what people are doing, not just how you feel. It's what people are doing to show that they love you. So keep that in mind.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. These are a few more of the popular websites. Again, they change all the time. It's very hard to keep up with them. Forced criminal activity. Many of you have probably heard of the term bottom. A bottom is a victim that is made to recruit others. So the trafficker has control of the individual. They force them into other types of criminal activity, including human trafficking, but not exclusive to human trafficking. It could be shoplifting. It could be any other form of criminal activity. In Georgia, we have a great law. It's called the Survivors First Act. We don't have time to go into it in depth, but it provides vacatur for victims of trafficking who have been convicted of crimes. It could be any crime as a result of their trafficking. And that is because what we know about forced criminal activity as well. As with victims, traffickers, buyers also can be anyone. Again, we are have an endless supply, and therefore there is a demand. The key really is to stop the demand, because if you don't have a demand, then you don't need a supply. But they can be anyone. The median age is 49 years old. 56% are married. 25 have children in their home. And this is specific to CSEC, or minor sex trafficking. 50% of that 25% have children in their home that are the same age as the individuals that they exploited. Not knowing that someone is underage isn't an excuse. Not knowing that they're being exploited isn't an excuse. It isn't a victimless crime. And to Vic's point, we really have to get this messaging out to the males in our society who are the driving demand behind human trafficking, sex trafficking as well. We've already talked about risk factors, child abuse in the home, sexual abuse, homelessness, poverty, lack of education, being a member of a socially marginalized group such as LGBTQ plus makes you at higher risk, and a history of being systems involved. Again, we would go on and on about this, but our juvenile justice system and our foster care system is a breeding ground for individuals who become vulnerable for exploitation. And you see the numbers go up if they have that type of systems involvement. Again, sexual abuse, statistically 70 to 90% of sexually exploited children have a history of sexual abuse. I cannot stand the term throwaway youth. That is painful to say, to even think that someone has a missing child is not looking for them. Those of you who are parents, imagine for a moment if you didn't know where your child was and you're not spending every waking moment looking for that child, doing something. That's the reality for some kids. That they run away and their parents are not looking, or their caregivers are not looking for them. And 60% report to be runaway, throwaway, or homeless youth. And 48% of those who engaged in commercial sex activity reported a lack of a safe place to sleep as the main reason. So this then becomes what we refer to as survival sex, right? I need a safe place to sleep, so I will provide a sexual act to an individual who's going to give me a couch. Again, in Georgia, it can be any thing of value. So a safe place to sleep is something of value, and that can be charged in Georgia under our human trafficking laws. And I think the federal ones are the same.
And Amy, I want to add, like, again, let's go back to a cultural mentality. Whenever we hear a child that's run away, the first thing we think, what's wrong with the child? So when I just want to throw this out there, whenever you're dealing with children with situations like this, let's stop asking children what's wrong with them and start using like what happened to them. Because a lot of this happened because of some things that are happening. They're running away from things. I don't think children run away from decent, loving, caring homes. Not to say that that never happens, but most likely not. So let's start changing our mentality on how we think about children that are labor runaway children. Let's start looking at them as what happened to them, then what's wrong with them.
100%. Thank you, Vic. Unfortunately, there's barriers to individuals who are put in that situation to identifying themselves. Vic, you were in law enforcement for many years. Did you ever have someone come up to you and say, "Sir, I'm a victim of human trafficking"?
No, we pray for that, by the way.
Right. There are barriers to that, right? There may be, again, that coercion piece, a threat to a loved one or a coworker. They may not have the transportation. They may fear retaliation. They have loyalty and trauma bonding to their trafficker. They are perhaps already distrusting of authority, but then that has been exacerbated by their trafficker. They may have debt bondage. They may be confined. They may not be able to. They may fear arrest themselves, and for good reason, right? But because of this, trafficking cases present very unique challenges. So again, they may distrust law enforcement. They may have rehearsed responses. They may be afraid to come forward, fear of judgment, etc. Again, because of trauma bonding that they have with their exploiter or trafficker.
And Amy, just want to add,
Talk about trauma bonding, Vic.
Yeah, because people really have to understand this. I can remember as an agent, we had rescued a young lady and had opened up an investigation. And then we found out that the young lady slept with the trafficker, and prosecutors started and we were really losing it because we didn't know about trauma bonding. We were like thinking about the case that no one would see her as a victim. And one thing that we have to understand, especially for our law enforcement people or prosecutors that are on site, the reason why these people are targeted because their life is a mess. And we have to be very careful with that. So when we talk about, and I know we're going to talk about victim-centered trauma informed, it can't be about your case, right? And we have to open up our minds to see beyond what a jury would think about certain things about a victim. And so learning about trauma bonding was huge. And that's why to continue learning in this space is so important.
An educated jury, a jury knows what they've been educated on. And so bring in a specialist in trauma bonding, bring in a specialist in a trauma-informed or the neurobiology of trauma into your cases if you're a prosecutor, and explain it to your jury so they understand. And that's I think a key in successful prosecution of these kinds of cases.
And I'll finish up with this point, Amy, because that's a good point. Some of the methods that we're using in South Florida is that we'll bring on that law enforcement expert that really knows about human trafficking. So to prepare the jury for what they're going to be seeing and understanding what all this means. So if some of you guys are out there, think about throwing your expert up first to explain to the jury what to expect from victims, and that may help you in your case.
Perfect. So we've talked already about pathways into the life of exploitation. I want to dig a little bit deeper for a second, because polyvictimization, if you're familiar with that term, is a pathway into exploitation. Polyvictimization refers to the multiple types of victimization in different settings by different individuals. So as opposed to re-victimization, which you would see, for example, with a child sexual abuse victim, where they're being abused over and over again in the same place, at home, for example, by the same person. Polyvictimization means the same person is getting victimized multiple different kinds of ways. And this is, I think, one of the biggest pathways into exploitation. So it's that collective experience of multiple types of victimization. And what you see on your screen now are just some examples of what that type of victimization may be. We've already talked about domestic violence. We've talked about sexual abuse. We've talked about physical abuse, but it could also be bullying, neglect, exposure to community violence, poverty, discrimination, racism. All these are exposures that a child may experience, can lead them into that vulnerability that could ultimately result in exploitation by a trafficker. We know that, unfortunately, our youth today are highly at risk. These are some statistics. 1 in 10 American children saw a family member assault another. Half of our children in our mental health, child welfare, juvenile justice, etc., are poly victims. And we know that once they've been exposed to one type of violence, they are more likely to be exposed to others. So to Vic's point, the key to a lot of this, not only just preventing human trafficking, preventing all kinds of issues, is really understanding childhood trauma and being able to mitigate that. And unfortunately, we have a challenging time doing that in our communities. We know 1 in 5. Yes, go ahead.
I would say a lot of that is because we're not dealing with our own traumas, right? Which is key, and I want to go back to one thing that you didn't have on that slide that I think people don't really think about when we have disasters, how those situations can also create, some vulnerabilities for traffickers to take advantages of families and children too.
Absolutely. It can get kind of in the weeds when you start to think about all the things that children are exposed to. As you can see on your slide, 30% of the sample in the National Child Victims Exposure to Violence Survey, that was a research study that was done, 30% of the sample experienced 5 or more types of victimization. 10% experienced 11 or more. So we begin to see really why traffickers have such a pool, a supply of vulnerable individuals. And I think that sex trafficking victims are probably one of the best examples of polyvictimization, right? So what you see on your screen now is a hypothetical situation. Alicia is 17. She presents to a doctor's office, and an astute nurse starts to realize that she may be dealing with some things. So they screen her, they get her into help. They find out that she was sexually abused as a child. She was exposed to domestic violence. She was the victim of verbal and physical abuse, sexually assaulted by buyers again and again and again. One sexual assault is one thing, multiple sexual assaults within one day. And that is a sexual assault, whether that child believes that they're participating willingly or not, multiple times a day. Threat of theft of a cell phone. That may not seem like a big deal to you and I. Mine was stolen the other day. I got it right back, but I have insurance on it, but if that's a lifeline, or if that's not something that they are going to get back, or if their trafficker is going to beat them because they don't have it, that is a very traumatic event. And then, of course, connection to gang violence. So now we begin to see the connection to gangs, right? So interestingly, what leads a youth into gang membership is very similar in terms of that pathway. Those individuals have also oftentimes been in situations where they're looking for something. They're looking for a connection. They're looking for a family environment. So these individuals that you see on your screen now are gang members. They may have also been sexually abused as a child. They may have also experienced physical abuse or verbal abuse, neglect, lack of supervision, community violence. Family members may be gang members, and their parents may be dealing with their own criminal justice issues. They may be in poverty. They may have access to firearms and weapons. So we begin to see that what makes an individual female, most times, vulnerable to exploitation may also make her male counterpart vulnerable to gang recruitment. So we begin to see that overlap already before we even get into the criminal activity. And we know that youth in gangs. Oh, did you want to say something, Vic?
Yeah, someone put in the chat, which is very true. The adverse child.
Yes, ACEs.
ACEs, right. Someone said, do we apply that to the victimization? Yes, that is all that.
100%.
Those things. What is, I think, the number? Anything over 4 or 5 of these events that happen in a child's life, they're showing high statistics of kids getting caught up in different, whether it's trafficking or drugs or anything.
That's right.
Last thing I would say to really, again, when we're talking about the culture of understanding, this is why it's so important for us to go back and do our homework to understand. And I usually say this: the kid that runs away from home, the kid that joins the gang, the kid that leaves and goes to college, the kid that maybe in the Middle East that straps on a bomb. The one thing that happened that all these kids have in common when they leave the house is that they're vulnerable. The question is, how vulnerable? Because if they meet with the right person, they can do a lot of great things. But a lot of times they're meeting with bad people that are convincing them to do something that they really didn't leave the house planning to do.
Right. So instead of meeting with someone who mitigates their childhood trauma, which anybody can do, a teacher, a social worker, a law enforcement, anyone who's providing victim services, they may meet with someone who exacerbates their trauma and adds to it as well. When we do a longer version of this presentation, we go way into, I'm glad someone brought up ACEs, because we go into ACEs. We even sometimes will poll our audience and give them the ACEs quiz, because we also see a lot of times first responders have had those experiences as well, which has motivated them to get into the field. So it's not uncommon at all for individuals that are providing these services to also have an ACEs score. It's interesting. I have one. I think a lot of us do. So thank you for bringing that up, whoever brought up ACEs. So we're going to get into a little bit more on gangs now. What does it mean to be in a gang? It's interesting because in Georgia, being in a gang isn't illegal, right? You can be in a gang, 3 people or more, but you have to be engaged in criminal activity. We have something, being in an illegal gang or committing illegal activities as a member of a gang is the illegal part, at least in the state of Georgia. This is what we refer to as the iron triangle. And is what you can see is a person who's an individual who is a member of a gang has to also be engaged in criminal activity that benefits the gang. And that in Georgia is what we have to establish in a court of law under our Illegal Street Gang and Terrorism Act, which is what we charge in Georgia. To your point, Vic, it's important for everyone to understand their own state laws. I don't know if you want to talk for a second about Florida or if we want to just move on, but it's important to understand that triangle. Okay, excellent. This is our law. I'm not going to go into it because we're running short of time, but if anyone is interested in our law in Georgia, reach out. I'd be happy to provide you with it. But now let's talk about this intersection, which is the reason why we're here today. Vic mentioned years ago when he was working with me in Georgia, we got real interested in this connection. So we started doing research. We found what we refer to as the San Diego study. This was conducted back in 2016 in San Diego. It was research that was done at the University of San Diego. And they started really looking at what was happening in their community. And what they found out was that 80% of the facilitators of sex trafficking in San Diego County had gang affiliation. I don't know if anybody's on from San Diego, but this was a very interesting study that we looked at. They also found that 90% of the schools in San Diego County confirmed that they had CSEC cases. Their average age of entry in San Diego County was 15 years old. That's very similar to what we see in Georgia. And their demographics for gang membership were across the board as well, white, African American, and Hispanic. What we see in Georgia is all of our gangs, regardless of the demographic rate or racial makeup of the gang, are involved in human trafficking. And in Georgia, a lot of our gangs are integrating. So where we used to have a Black gang or a white gang or a Hispanic gang, a lot of them now are kind of coming together and collaborating, for lack of a better word, on their illegal activities. So at the end of the day, what they found in San Diego was that their problem was a lot bigger than they thought. And so we took that and started looking at it in Georgia as well, because we knew anecdotally it was happening, but we didn't really have the evidence to show it. We also looked at the National Gang Assessment, said the same thing. This was many years ago, but they were basically saying that they know it's happening amongst gangs and it's on the rise. And they gave some examples in that National Gang Assessment as well. Back in 2011, we knew that it was increasing based on these particular studies. Same thing in Texas. The Texas Gang Threat Assessment indicated that their gangs were trafficking both adults and juveniles because of the perceived, again, low risk, high profitability. And it was all gangs, national gangs, regional gangs, neighborhood gangs. They're all understanding the profitability of exploitation of individuals in sex trafficking. In Georgia, we knew that 60% of our crimes were related to gangs, and that it was happening across the board. It's not specific to major urban areas. It's not an Atlanta issue. We've got gangs all over the state, and they're in the schools. They're in the rural communities. They're in the medium-sized towns. We have 159 counties in the state of Georgia, second only to Texas, and it is happening everywhere here as well. We also know that gangs will mark their victims with tattoos. So what we tell gang investigators is if you see individuals, female mostly, that have gang tattoos, that you consider to be gang members or gang affiliated, they may be being trafficked. It is worth looking into. Vic, do you want to talk any more about tattoos and branding? Because I know you know a lot about this.
No, I mean, it is so true, let alone gang members are, branding, their members. Traffickers also brand their victims to let other traffickers know this is my property. I don't know if you have that picture, Amy, that we use, but there's this young lady with a tattoo of the word loyalty written on her face.
Okay.
I saw that years ago. Everyone was demeaning this young lady, calling her an idiot, that she'll never find a job. And then I posed one simple question. Does anybody consider this young lady a human trafficking victim? And the noise stopped because they hadn't, and she was. So we have to be aware if your child or people that you see in school are wearing these types of, different types of tattoos, my property, the barcode, you might want to ask questions about it.
Yeah, thank you. I wish we had time to go more into that. We knew that anecdotally that we thought this was an issue in Georgia, but we didn't have, again, the data. Our arrest data wasn't showing it. Our prosecution data wasn't showing this connection. But we have a place in Georgia called the Receiving Hope Center. And this is a 90-day facility where trafficking victims who are recovered through law enforcement or perhaps child welfare investigations are brought. It's a secure facility. It used to be a youth detention center, but it got real pretty. They pottery barned it out, I like to say. It's prettier than my house. And it offers victims an opportunity to heal, get therapy, get medical attention, and there's a school within this facility as well. There's also a medical program. So the nurses there began noticing as these young females were coming into the Receiving Hope Center that a lot of them had gang tattoos. So they began to screen them and ask them about their tattoos. And what they found was that 67% of the girls coming in as sex trafficking victims in Georgia had gang affiliation. Gang affiliation, gangs, as you all know, have a code of silence and secrecy as well. So I would say that 33% that did not disclose of that 33%, some of them are also gang affiliated as well. So that number is probably higher, but we knew at least 67% had gang affiliation. So what can you do about this? We're going to talk to close today about just a few things that we're doing in Georgia, and then Vic's going to close with an awesome part on society and what we can do as a society. In Georgia, we have a specialized unit. It's called the HEAT unit. It is at our state police, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. These agents are specifically focused on human trafficking, human exploitation and trafficking unit. So if you don't have a specialized unit, this is one way you can really be able to combat the issue of gangs and human trafficking, is by having that specialized unit. We also have our Georgia Gang Investigators Association. Vic mentioned it earlier. We offer the members of our gang investigators a certification in human trafficking. Years ago, Vic and I went, they weren't talking about trafficking. They were talking about guns and drugs and a lot of things. we infiltrated and made sure that they understood human trafficking as well, because those gang investigators are the ones who are really going to be on the front lines of identifying potential victims as well. Specialty courts. In Cobb County, we have a great court called the Rising Court, and this is specific to at-risk youth who could potentially join gangs. So as they come into the juvenile justice system, if they are identified through screening as possible gang affiliates, they have the opportunity to go ahead and through this treatment court become a part of a program that is aimed to divert them away from gang membership and to become productive citizens. So specialized courts. Similarly, we have a court down in Savannah called the Hope Court that is for human trafficking victims, young ladies who are also juvenile justice involved. There's a similar one in Miami that one in Savannah modeled after, that is geared towards, again, getting a victim to recognize their victimization and begin healing, giving them an opportunity to get out of the juvenile justice system and heal and receive treatment as well. We also have a specialized prosecution unit at our Attorney General's office. So our human trafficking prosecution unit is our go-to for prosecutions because they understand human trafficking. Vic was talking earlier about sometimes you have to educate your prosecutor so they understand victimization. When you have a specialized unit, they are specifically trained to do exactly that. We also have a state hotline, 1-866-NHTGA. So this allows us to connect service providers or law enforcement or child welfare workers directly with the services that their victims need. We have a state network of children's advocacy centers that have a CSEC response team that are engaged, that are specially trained to assist with law enforcement or child services once they've identified a potential human trafficking victim. They will provide an assessment. They'll confirm whether that child was a human trafficking victim, and then they'll get them the help that they need. And they can do that all through NHTGA, 866-NHTGA. Same thing for adult victims, same thing for labor victims. You can also connect with that Receiving Hope Center for residential services. So it's geared to provide a comprehensive one way to get in touch with all the services that are needed through that hotline. We also have a data clearinghouse. It's amazing. Don't have time to go into it. If you're interested in our data clearinghouse that allows us to see where hotspots may be across the state, please email me. I'll be happy to get it to you. Y'all might recognize this guy. Vic, why don't you take it from here?
Well, yeah, if we were sitting, in person, I normally like to ask, because again, it goes back to culture and what parts we play. And I normally would ask the audience, have they ever dressed up as a pimp or a prostitute or attended a pimps and hoe party for Halloween throughout their life? And the next slide is obviously that's me. And I don't mind throwing myself under the bus, because why I speak so passionately about this, and I tell people I speak from my learned experience, as not as a victim, but someone who's worked in this space for 14 years that often said, if most men knew what I knew, but decided to act on it, because it's not enough to know. This recalls some action, and decided to act on it. This is something that I think we can really get a handle on, but it really takes all of us, and especially people that are working in this space. You have to take care of yourself, because you can get some traumas dealing with this, and it will affect you and how you're dealing with victims and how you're dealing with your family. And to be honest, until I dealt with my own traumas and went down that road of self-care, only then I could open up my own organization and work in this space. So people, you have to be mindful of taking care of yourself in this space. Only then we will start to see more. I tell people it is so easy when human trafficking is the only thing that you have to focus on. But Some offices don't have that space. So you're doing rape charges, you're doing human trafficking, you're doing sexual assault, you're doing a lot of different things, because what makes this crime so unique is that, like Amy mentioned before, it's very rare that you're going to have a human trafficking victim calling and saying, help, I'm a human trafficking victim. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen often enough, like those other crimes, that we see. So when we're talking about this, when you're educating people about this, it is truly about all of us. And the more, and I like to just say, what we do in this space is that we empower people with the information, because only with the information you can make better choices in addressing this. So as you can see, the young lady, when we were talking tattoos earlier, I mean, how could we not see this? When we go back to talking about culture, let's throw the state of Florida and Georgia under the bus a little bit. Because when we started our first human trafficking laws back in the year 2000, that was the first time the Trafficking Victims Protection Act came about. But it took the state of Florida 16 years to finally pass a law that says no more arresting kids under the age of 18 for prostitution, because in that 2000 law, it says if you're under the age of 18 and you're in a commercially sexually exploited, you are a victim. But this is how hard it takes our culture to catch up with laws, because it's been so embedded. So I would leave with just saying this, guys. The more you get into this, the more you should be doing self-assessments on yourself to make sure that you're dealing with it from a healthy point of view, especially when you're dealing with trafficking victims, because it's going to be even more of a challenge when you're looking at people that don't even see themselves as a victim. So make sure you stay in that. And so I would kind of like end there, because I could go on and on. I know we touched on how important it is to communicate with children, try to do a self-test of love, give them that security, and really deal with yourself so you can see more what's going on. Because I know Robin wants to do a really in-depth Q&A, which I think you guys will gain more from that. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I mean, applause, applause, applause. You are just wonderful. And all the kudos coming in, both online in terms of the chat as well as the Q&A. So let me jump into some questions right away. Fantastic. Look at loves and up hand, thumbs up. So a couple of people asked about immigration, and this comes up a lot when I do trainings as well, which is people talk about what about this huge influx? Have you seen a difference in the people that you're assisting because of all of the, changes in immigration? We haven't at STAC. I mean, immigrants to me are more vulnerable to being trafficked is what we have seen. But there have been, do you want to make any comments about immigrations and maybe some of those misnomers or misconceptions about human trafficking and immigration?
So real quick, being a Homeland Security agent, I would like, what I like to tell people is it's so important for us to know about this stuff, especially labor trafficking. I know if you live in Florida and probably in Georgia, eventually you're going to cross somebody that has document issues. People need to know, and a lot of these people that have these issues are afraid to come forward because they're being overworked, they're being unpaid, they're being threatened that if they don't do what they're told, they're going to be turned into human trafficking. Well, let me just give you guys, they do have rights. Normally, when recognized by law enforcement, victims get what they call continuing presence. That gives them 2 years of legal status in the country plus work authorization. And if you pretty much are qualified for continuing presence, then you can most likely qualify for what we call a T visa, the trafficking visa, which can give you a more permanent status. But it's so important that we know what these rules and laws are, let alone the people that are caught up in that needs to know.
Yeah, and I would add, here in Georgia, we actually received, I just got this news the other day. To date, we've gotten about $16 million from a private foundation to address agricultural labor trafficking. And so what we see in South and Middle Georgia and all over Florida is individuals who are brought into the country legally, immigrants, migrant farm workers, who are then exploited. And so this is very common. And it's an area that I think we haven't, up until now in Georgia, had the resources to address. There was a huge HSI operation. It's now called Operation Blue Onion. I think it was
Blooming
originally
Onion.
called, well, it was originally called Blooming Onion, but
Yeah, it's blue.
well, yeah, I think there might have been a trademark issue there. And so, yeah. And so, I think they were politely asked to call it something else by a major restaurant chain. But we see this, and we're trying to address it in Georgia through private foundation funding. And so, it's an area I think that we don't, when we talk about misperceptions and human trafficking in general, that's one of the biggest one, the connection with immigration and legal immigration.
Right. And really, I think there's a statistic from the pandemic that, some of the most exploited essential workers were people working in agriculture, and they were here legally. So, yeah.
So if you're from a state where you have a robust agricultural industry, definitely reach out, because we can help you kind of take a deeper look at maybe what might be happening there with agricultural labor trafficking.
You know what? I think I hear another webinar coming on for 2025 already. Thank you.
That'd be great.
Somebody just asked about how the victims are getting involved with gangs initially, peer-to-peer, online. You kind of covered some of this, all of the above, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's something called being sexed in. Sometimes they're sexed into the gang. They're forced to have sex with gang members as their initiation into the gang. Again, because of all those vulnerabilities that we've talked about, they become susceptible to that, just like a victim may become susceptible from a trafficker that is not gang affiliated. Vic, this is your thing. Go for it.
Because what's happening at home, these kids, like I said earlier, the kid that joins the gang, goes to college, runs away, or, in the Middle East, straps on a bomb. The one thing that they all have in common is that not only just being vulnerable, but they're looking to connect. We're human beings. We want to connect to other people. But with the lack of security within ourselves, we are attached to something that we know that's not good for us because we think they love us. Again, to me, it goes back to love. What is love? Love is not trying to get you locked up doing criminal activity and telling you I love you. Love is not like I love you, but go sell your body so I can make money. Parents, we really need to start doing this education to our kids. I know in Florida, we passed laws that our doctors and nurses have to learn about human trafficking, but we also passed laws that we should be teaching this in school, but it's not taught in every school yet. But I would definitely like to see teachers and administrators being forced to learn this. If anything, let's get them going, like we got doctors and lawyers and doctors and nurses going.
Remember, please, too, that if you can support our programs, we'd love it. Stack Services and this program, we want to keep them coming to you for no cost. So help us stay alive on this. That would be great. And I really want to thank you, Amy Hutsell, you, Victor Williams, for your expertise, for your passion, and, which is only matched by your brilliance in these subject matter areas, and how you've helped us all learn more about this, this really important intersection. I will say this is a first of several conversations I hope we can be having. Please stay in touch with us, and everybody, thank you for attending today. Thank you for being part of a community that's learning more to stand with survivors.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.